My name is Mark Levine. I'm the president of the French American Heritage Foundation. And if you didn't know it, today is National Acadian Day. If you don't know anything about Acadians, you're about to find out, because we got a Cajun from Louisiana who came up here, all the way from Louisiana. He's going to talk to us tonight about Acadians. His name is Marty Guidry. He was a research chemist at DuPont, where he retired after 27 years as a career. He spent 40 years studying the genealogy and history of the Acadians and basically that was his part-time hobby or studies. And his studies focused on the culture, language, history, and genealogy of the Acadian people from the early 1600s to the present. And today, Marty Guidry, all the way from Louisiana, is going to talk to us about the Acadian deportation and some interesting facts and information that you may have never heard about before, but are about to hear tonight. So I want to present Mr. Marty Guidry.
I'll speak a little bit about the Arcadians tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about where they came from, because maybe somebody doesn't know about the Arcadians. Oh, that works, huh? Basically, where is Acadia? And Acadia used to be thought of as Nova Scotia. If we're talking Canada right now, we're talking eastern Canada, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. But over time, Acadia became a lot larger. It became Nova Scotia, it became Prince Edward Island, became what's now called Cape Breton Island. It was called Ile Royale. It also is New Brunswick, and it even picks up a little bit of Maine up at the very northeastern edge of Maine, called Aroostook County. And if you ever go to Aroostook County, the most wonderful people in the world, 95% of the population speaks Cajun, French, and English. They truly Cajun people, more so than in Louisiana even. But so anyway, that's what Acadia is. One thing about Acadians, we don't know much about technology, so I'll make a lot of mistakes with this technology. But anyway, where did the Acadians come from, and who are they? Well, originally the Acadians came from France, most of them. There were 4 major migrations into Acadia. The first ones occurred in 1604. We were the first Europeans to come to North America and form a permanent settlement. Forget Jamestown, okay? Acadia was here in 1604. They settled on the St. Croix River in a little island called St. Croix Island. It only lasted 1 year. They made a mistake. They thought they had this island. It was beautiful. They'd be able to get all they need to eat and everything, but they forgot that they have winters up there like they do here. And the water froze over, and they were stuck on the island with no food. About half of them died of scurvy. The remaining went to Port Royal, which is in Nova Scotia itself. And so we ended up, instead of 79 people, with about 40 people that settled around Port Royal. The next big migration occurred in 1632, and they went to an area called La Have. And that's, we'll show a map in a minute, and I'll show you where La Have is. They brought a few women. That's the first women we get. And then it wasn't until 1636 that they brought some more colonists in, and they had about half men and half women, because they brought families, and they settled at La Have. About that time, the governor dies. When the governor dies, someone else takes over. All havoc breaks out, and they decided to move the whole colony from La Have to Port Royal. And that's why you hear the Acadians always in Port Royal now, because it moved up there. But a few smart Acadians didn't move, like the Guidry family, and they stayed in the La Have area. So we come from that area, not Port Royal. So the Acadians, I like things to be big, so I make a big point of it. But the Acadians, most people think the Acadians came from this area right here around Poitou province and La Rochelle. In fact, they came from all over France. They came from the Alsace-Lorraine area, they came from the Normandy area, they came from around Bordeaux, and they came from the La Rochelle, Poitiers area. We even had Acadians that came from England, the Melançon family. They didn't call themselves Melançon, they were Melancons, but we changed their name for them, called them Melançon. We had a few people that are Flemish, such as what they call Petrie, but we call Piet. and some other nationalities like that. So just like anywhere, everybody blends together. So they get there, they adopt the culture, they begin to speak French, they forget how to speak English, and they become Acadian. And they suffered the deportation just like everybody else. Okay, so Acadia, as you think of it there, just sitting out there in Nova Scotia, you say, what's important about Acadia? Why did these countries want Acadia? Because it's just an island, not much about it, except that there are a few unique facts about it. One is the European countries wanted the interior of Canada. They wanted Quebec, Montreal, that area. They wanted to settle it. And there's only one way to get there. That's through the St. Lawrence River, and guesses which is just south of the St. Lawrence River, Nova Scotia. So if you control Nova Scotia, you control the St. Lawrence River. There's another problem. People like to eat. And the best fishing banks in North America are just south of Nova Scotia, both between Cape Breton Island and Nova Scotia and just to the south of there. So for 1500 on, they've been fishing those banks. You want to control the Nova Scotia, you control the fishing. Then there was something called farming. Some of the best farmland in North America today is in Nova Scotia. And so they wanted to bring those good English colonists, as we'll see, to Nova Scotia. And so there was a lot of fighting going on. There were 6 major wars between 1604, 1605, and 1710 between France and England. The country changed hands at least 10 times. Why they only had 6 wars? They changed hands 10 times. Because sometimes it wasn't a war, it was just a ship coming in, destroying Port Royal, the English take over. And then a little bit later, a French ship comes in, takes back Port Royal. So that wasn't a war, but it was a change of country for those people. So when you have your country changed a lot, you tend to become neutral, because you don't want to take sides for one or the other, because pretty soon you could be on the wrong side again. So you stay neutral. So the Acadians started being called French neutrals, because they refused to fight for either side. In 1710, England won for the final time, and they had a treaty in 1713 called Utrecht, and some of the conditions of that treaty, in order to keep the Acadians farming, because they didn't have any other people to farm Nova Scotia at that time, or Acadia, they gave them some conditions. They said they could remain Catholic. They said they could own their own land. They said they could leave Acadia anytime within a year, as long as they told the Queen. It became a problem, as you'll see. And finally, they had to take an unqualified oath of allegiance to the British king. Well, one of the problems they had was the Queen died during that year. And so when they said they wanted to leave, the governor of Acadia said, no, you can't leave till we can get a new leader. But the year passed before they got a new leader, so they were stuck. They couldn't leave. And the unqualified oath of allegiance wasn't something they wanted to take, because it said they had to fight for Britain, and they weren't going to fight for either side. So that became a sticking point. The land was good. I don't know how many Acadians we have here, but if we have any Acadians, and I know we have a few, if your grandparents ever talked to you about anything, it was about owning land. Land was quite important to Acadians. They were peasants from France originally, and in France, peasants couldn't own land. The Acadians were the first people to ever own land, first peasants to ever own land in France. They were the first people to ever own land in Acadia. And so it was very proud people in that they owned land. So why did they have to leave? Why did the British want to kick them out? They were good farmers. They were doing well. The British, they were supporting the fort at Port Royal. They had about 1,000 British soldiers who couldn't survive without them. They provided the firewood. They provided the labor force. They provided the food for the fort and at Port Royal. But there were 13,000 Acadians, and I guess if you're 1,000 people looking 13,000 Acadians, it doesn't look too good. But the main reason people quote is because they wouldn't take the oath of allegiance. They said since they wouldn't take the oath of allegiance, they would have to leave Acadia. That's not really, I think, what happened. I think there were some other factors that we'll point out. For one thing, they were French and Catholic, and Britain is British and Protestant. And Catholics and Protestants didn't get along very well back then. So that was a big sticking point. Another thing is they did refuse to take the oath unqualified. They did take the oath qualified. They said, yeah, we'll take the oath. Just put a phrase in there saying we don't have to fight against anyone, and it's fine. And in the 1730s, they did that. but the queen, or king rather, refused to accept that, so it didn't count. And they claimed that Acadians actually did take up arms. And out of 13,000 Acadians in 1747, 12 of them took up arms against Britain. There was a battle at Grand Pre in the middle of the winter. The Acadians led a French fort from Beaubassin to Grand Pre through waist-deep snow for 2 days and brought them into Grand Pre, and the French destroyed Grand Pre and the British fort there. And then there was another time in 1755 when the British wanted to attack. It's hard to stand still, especially the Acadian. But the Acadians in Beauséjour, they lived in Beaubassin. The French priests there wanted them to move to French territory in New Brunswick and get out of Nova Scotia. So they had the Indians, the Mi'kmaq, come and destroy Beaubassin. They set the whole town on fire and burn it. So the Acadians had to move a mile north to the fort at Beauséjour to survive. The French commander made them take up arms and get in the fort, 300 Acadians. When the British attacked and won the fort, they found these 300 Acadians and said they took up arms. The French commander said they didn't. They just were brought into the fort by me. But the British still didn't believe it, and they used that against them. But those aren't the real reason. One of the reasons is they frustrated the English to no end for over 100 years. They were conniving people. We still are conniving people. How were they conniving? Well, for example, the British would bring them in and say, you got to go ahead and take this oath of allegiance. And the Cajuns had a very good government system. They had deputies in their area, in their communities, and these deputies were like judges. They'd make minor decisions on where boundaries of land were, different marital problems that might arise. They would make these decisions, and they represented the Acadians. So they called the deputies in and say, you need to take the oath of allegiance for your people. They said, sure, we'll take the oath of allegiance. No problem. Says it's got to be an unqualified. No problem. All you have to do is assure us that the Mi'kmaq won't attack us. Because if you say we have to fight against the Mi'kmaq and the French and you, the Mi'kmaq might attack us. If you guarantee us the Mi'kmaq won't attack us, we'll take the oath of allegiance. They said, we can't guarantee that. They said, well, then we won't take the oath of allegiance. Of course, they knew the Mi'kmaq would never attack them. The Acadians were the only people in North America from Europe that ever got along with the Indians and never had a fight with the Indians. So they were very friendly. They occupied different areas of the country and got along well and helped each other out. So they were conniving type people. I mentioned the organizations that the British really didn't like, the fact that they couldn't break the Acadians up. They were organized. They had deputies and a system of government, and it was very difficult for the British to get in there and individually get to anybody. They had to do the whole organization. Plus the priests, I can't get into it about priests too much here, but anyway, the priests were really French emissaries. The priests represented the French government. So the French government, of course, didn't like the British, so the priests worked with the Indians and worked with the Acadians to be against the British, especially the Indians. They had the Indians attacking the British quite frequently. And the British knew this, but they didn't know what to do. And so they took it out on the Acadians that their priests were working for France, which they were. Now, one of the big sticking points is the Acadians were innovative. I don't know how many of y'all know what abattoirs are, but it's a dike system that the Acadians developed. They had the dike system in Europe already back in the 1600s, especially around the Netherlands and that area. And so the Acadians brought it there, and the tides at the Bay of Fundy are 50 foot high. And they come over the lands and then they drain off, providing very, very fertile marshland. Well, the Acadians developed a levee system. They put abattoirs. Abattoirs were little wooden troughs that ran under the levee, and they had a really neat device. On the end of it was a flapper. Really hard to think of, right? They had a flapper. What would happen is when the tides would rise, that flapper would stay closed. The tides couldn't get over the levee, so they would go back down. But when it would rain and water would get into the fields, it could flow right out that flapper. So it could clean those fields out, clean all that salt water out of the field. It took 3 years. And then those forms could be formed for hay, crops, whatever they wanted, cattle. And they still are the best farmlands in North America, those things. So the British thought, hey, that's pretty cool. But we got these Massachusetts people that want farmland. Why don't we get those Cajuns Arcadians, out of there and bring some good settlers down here, some good farmers and farm that land. And that was one of the reasons they got rid of them, as we'll see. Of course, I think the last two are the real reasons. There were 1,000 British and 13,000 French. And right around 1754, brewing up was another war between France and England. And Colonel Lawrence was pretty assured, although not right, that the Acadians would take up arms against them, and it'd be 13,000 to 1,000. Not great odds for the British. So he decided to get rid of the Acadians. So these good people here made a decision on July 28th. I'm sure most of y'all aren't aware of that date, but in Louisiana we celebrate that as a day of mourning, and we seriously do. We don't celebrate it, but we have activities where we remember that date as the day that the order was signed by Colonel Lawrence and the council to deport the Acadians from Nova Scotia, July 28, 1755. You can see the folks that were involved, but the major folks was the Chief Justice of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, who wrote the decision, flawed as it was, that the Acadians deserved to be deported. And a surveyor by the name of Charles Morris developed a plan to capture the Acadians so they couldn't escape. And we'll see what he did. And finally, the governor, Charles Lawrence, was the one who instigated that, along with the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Shirley. Massachusetts was very big in this, so if you got any friends in Massachusetts, you ought to get rid of them pretty quick if you're Acadian. No, I'm just kidding. I got friends there too. They're nice now. They've okay. And this was the order. It was 7 pages long. This is the first and last page. You can see Lawrence's signature. But basically, it's just the order saying that they're going to capture all the Acadians and deport them to Acadia, from Acadia. It doesn't say where they're going. Nobody knew where they were going except two people, Charles Lawrence and Governor Shirley. So what was the way they did it? Well, they used the fact that the Acadians were fairly religious people. They went and posted a note on the door of the church saying all men between 10, I bet a lot of 10-year-olds would like to think that they were men now, but all men between 10 and any age upwards had to appear to the church at a certain date and a certain time, and didn't say why. So all of them filed into church. As soon as they were all in church, the soldiers locked the doors and held them in there. Left the women and the girls and the younger children at the farms, because they needed somebody. It was harvest season. It was in the September time frame, and they needed somebody to harvest the crop and to feed these men that were locked in the church and clothe them. So the women could come in and bring food and bring clothing and all for their husbands and brothers and children that were in the church. And so they were held there about a month in these churches. And they would allow the men to go out about 5 to 6 at a time and go visit their farms and their wives so that they could make sure the crops were coming in. But you can bet if they let a father go, his son did not go. They always kept one family member there. So if you didn't appear, your family member was in trouble. Once they started putting them on the boats, and we'll see that here. So there basically were 4 areas that they had to capture the people, and they did a pretty good job. Some Acadians escaped, but they got most of them. There was a Copiquid and Minas Basin, which we call Grand Pre. There's a Pissaquid area, which is just outside of Grand Pre. There was a Port Royal area that they had them, and the last area, I guess, was the Beaubassin area up on the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia border, right at the border there at Beaubassin. Boston was fairly important in this. For example, the governor was one of the instigators of it. And they had 24 ships, basically, that were used in the deportation. And almost all of those came from a firm out of Boston called Apthrop and Hancock. So they provided all the ships that were deporting the Acadians. So there were 2 major campaigns that were deporting the Acadians, and then some minor stuff that occurred. The first one was all the Acadians in Nova Scotia. Now, Acadians were in Nova Scotia, but they also, around 1750, started getting wind something was in the air, and a lot of them took off and went to Prince Edward Island and to Cape Breton Island. So we find a lot of Acadians up there. A few went into New Brunswick. But the ones in Nova Scotia were all captured, and in 1755 and 56 they started deporting them. They brought them up to the ships after they had been captured for about a week. Nobody knew where they were going. They just knew they were leaving for good. They burnt the farms, destroyed the crops and livestock so that the Acadians would not have anything to come back to. And if you were one of the, quote, fortunate Acadians that in the middle of the winter you went into the woods with nothing, you wouldn't have anything to come back to either. So you would starve to death or turn yourself in, one of the two. They started putting them on the ships. They said they were going to keep everybody together. That became really a problem. They had two problems. One is they had a lot more Acadians than they thought they had. They only had 24 ships. They weren't supposed to put more than 2 Acadians per ton to the ship. So if you had a 90-ton vessel, you could put 180 Acadians. But they started putting 200, 250 Acadians. But they only put enough food for 180. And they were going to be on these ships for a month or a little longer. So it became a real problem. And we'll see some of that. The second campaign they had was the Island Campaign. That was from 2 years later when they captured Louisburg. They decided they were going to deport those Acadians from Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton Island, or Ile Royale. The Acadians from Nova Scotia were British citizens, right? So they've been British citizens for 45 years, since 1713, basically. And Britain forgot a couple of things. They forgot first, you can't deport your own citizens. But they did it anyway. They forgot 2 or 3 other things involved with the law around deportations and all. For example, you couldn't confiscate property of your citizens without a trial. Yet they burnt their villages, burnt their houses, burnt their churches, took their cattle and killed them or slaughtered them, and took their crops. And so it became a legal thing, but it didn't matter because once it's done, it's done. And it wasn't until 2003 that Britain apologized to the Acadians for doing that and admitting they made a legal mistake. But it didn't do much good to those folks that were deported in 1755. So the second deportation then was the island deportation from Cape Royale and Cape Breton Island. From Ile Royale and Ile St. John, excuse me. Then we had a few of them. They forgot a few Acadians. Down on the southern end at Cape Sable, they had about 200 or 300 Acadians. So they went and rounded those up and decided to deport those. And eventually they had a few others they captured that had escaped. So we'll go through a couple of those in a minute. But we find this in the Pennsylvania Gazette. I love reading papers. I don't know if y'all do, especially 1755. They're very interesting because all they have is words. There's no pictures or anything, and it's almost impossible to read the typescript of these newspapers. I'm sorry I'm in front of some people, but I got to stand here, they said. So it's an interesting article here. It's easier to read if I put it this way. We don't know who wrote it. Probably Colonel Lawrence wrote it, we think, or maybe Governor Shirley. But it basically says, we're now upon a great and noble scheme of sending the French out of this province, who have always been secret enemies, and have encouraged our savages to cut our throats. That never happened. If we effect their expulsion, it will be one of the greatest things that the English ever did in America. By all accounts, that part of the country they possess is as good land as any in the world. In case, therefore, we should get some good English farmers in their room, this province would abound with all kinds of provisions, as if it didn't already. I mean, the Acadians already were illegally trading with Boston and illegally trading with the French at Cape Breton Island with all the excess that they were producing, and they were giving stuff to, or selling stuff supposedly, to the fort at Port Royal. So they were already producing a lot. But, of course, if you're a good English citizen, you do better. And so that was the thing. Now I put this up there so you can kind of look at it for a second. It's important. Notice this mother and think about her. There they are with all their goods. They were promised they could bring anything they could carry on the ships. Well, that was a lie, because that would have been true if they would only put 2 people per ton, but when they started putting 220 to 250 people on a ship and they were supposed to put 180, they weren't able to put any goods on the ship. So they had to leave all their personal belongings behind. If it couldn't fit in your pocket, it didn't go. But they also didn't tell them where they were going. They didn't know if they were going to Antarctica, France, England, or the colonies. The law at that time said that if you were being deported from an English colony, you had to go to England or to another English colony. And so they did follow that law, and they deported the first ones from Nova Scotia along the eastern seaboard of the U.S., as we'll see. So but they didn't know that at the time. So here's a mother with her baby, knowing she's getting ready to get on this boat, not knowing where she's going, not even knowing if her baby would survive. Many didn't. Many parents didn't. About a third of them were lost during the voyage. We can see here a little girl comforting her grandmother who's crying. There's a husband and wife. They weren't even sure they were going to be together, and many weren't. They promised they would be. They tried over here, so they got separated. They ended up in different colonies. We have records of people looking for their family for years, trying to find their wife or children. So it's a pretty sad state there. So the Acadians that were, as we mentioned, on Nova Scotia went to the English colonies. Those that were on Ile Royale and Cape Breton, that was a French colony. It was owned by France still, Ile St. John and Ile Royale. And so those people couldn't go to the English colonies. They had to go to France. So that's why you ended up with this group of roughly 2,500 Acadians that ended up in France and spent 30 years in France before the Spanish government decided to bring them to Louisiana. So so you had, those people had to go there. Now that was followed most of the time. Every now and then they'd catch a few Acadians on Nova Scotia and not know what to do with them and send them to France. But generally they followed the law in this area. So what was it like to be on these boats? They had the worst luck in the world, I'll tell you that. Not only were they being deported, but they were enemies. The captains were afraid that they would mutiny, and one ship did mutiny, and the Acadians took possession of it and brought it back to Nova Scotia area. But they were afraid, so they put them in the hull of the ship. Now, when you're in the hull of the ship, it's not the St. Mary, okay? Or the St. whatever it is, it's a cruise ship. You were down there, it was plank flooring, it was cold because most of it was underwater that you were sitting in. There was no sanitary facilities whatsoever. Everything went to the floor. These were land people, not sea people by and large, so there was a lot of seasickness. You can imagine where that went. The only light you had was that little hole that you climbed down through. You weren't given fresh air, it was stale. And sickness was rampant, especially because they overcrowded the ship. So if one person came down with an illness, everybody got that illness. The dead people that they died were just thrown overboard. You can imagine if you're a mother and you have to get rid of your daughter or son or your husband or wife. Some people lost their whole family and only one survived. They had 6 or 8 children and the husband all died and the wife survived, or vice versa. They have records. But they not only had all that problem, almost within a week after the majority of them were on the water, a hurricane hit. And so they had to withstand this hurricane. Several of the ships were badly damaged and had to go into Boston Harbor. The Boston people realized they were overcrowded and removed people to get them to 2 a ton. The writings that we have at the Boston Archives in Boston, and Massachusetts Archives in Boston, say that these people are just laying on the ship, sick, can't hardly even move. They actually brought them on board to get them some air as they got into the harbor. So they took 40 to 50 people off each boat. We don't know if they survived or not, but we know they were removed. Then the boats took off again when the weather cleared and they were repaired. Not only that, they had an earthquake that hit while they were out there. And the earthquake started at Cape Ann, Massachusetts, and affected the whole part of the eastern United States all the way below Maryland. And it was a fairly major earthquake. So not only did they feel that in the boat, but when they eventually landed, the people weren't too happy to see them because they're still recovering from an earthquake. So it created problems there. So I'll just put this back up. Think about the mom and the grandmother and the couple here. Where'd they end up? They all ended up in different places. Acadians were very close-knit people, still are. They have extended families. You go into Nova Scotia and everybody's a cousin to everybody and they know everybody, and if you ask somebody who they are, they'll say, I'm Jean Hebert, Pierre, Robert, and that's all their grandparents. They know 7 generations of their family, so that you know who they descend from, and you know how you're a cousin to them. And so they're very close to their families, and they all got separated in this. Here's where they were deported to: Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Only thing is, Virginia didn't want them. So what Virginia did is said, England, you sent us those 1,200 people, we're going to give them back to you. And they put them on some more boats and put them out in the ocean for another 2 months to go to England. And when they got to England, they put them in 4 towns in warehouses there initially. About half of them died within about 3 years, 4 years. So it was pretty tough for those people. The best ones were right here, Pennsylvania, because these people were Catholic. In Pennsylvania, allowed the Catholic religion and encouraged the Catholic religion. They had St. Joseph's Church in Philadelphia, still there today, founded in 1733. And they allowed the Acadians to practice their religion, and they were able to get the sacraments and stuff. And they had the Quakers. And if you don't know anything about the Quakers, they're very religious people. They believe that God's flame is in everybody, from an Indian to Acadian to anybody. And so they believe you got to take care of everybody. And they strongly supported the Acadians physically with food and housing and stuff like that. I'm not saying it was great, but it was better than some of the other ones. The next best group was Maryland. Maryland tolerated Catholics. Catholics didn't have liberty there. There were laws against Catholics. But if you were rich enough, you could have a chapel and you could have a priest. You couldn't publicly practice Catholicism, but you could practice it. And the Acadians were lucky. There was a family by the name of Charles Carroll and family, and they were able to loan their priest to the Acadians to come to the home one of the homes where the Acadians stayed in Baltimore and say Mass once a month. So they did get some religion there. Other than that, you didn't get much in the English colony. If you went to Georgia, you were breaking the law, because it was illegal for a Catholic to set foot in Georgia. So what Georgia did is they decided that they would just give the Acadians some old rickety boats and tell them they could go back up north, which they did. Several drowned in the boats. And when they got to Massachusetts, Massachusetts said, you can't be going up to Nova Scotia. So they arrested them all and kept them in Massachusetts. But by the way, when they arrived in all these colonies, with the exception of 2, Massachusetts and Connecticut, they didn't even know they were coming. In fact, the governors weren't even there. The governors were in New York planning the French and Indian War. So they had a council they had to take care of them. They didn't know what to do. And so they were kind of just left on ships for up to a month, waiting for the governor to return. The reason Massachusetts and Connecticut knew something is the governor of Massachusetts is the one that planned this whole thing, right? So he knew they were coming, and he was friends with the governor of Connecticut, so he told them. So those 2 people were able to develop some plan ahead of time. Now I want y'all to memorize this, as any school kids would, right? But I just want you to, I put that up there not to memorize. I have a couple things I'll say. One is, it was a complex operation. This is just the ones that went to the eastern seaboard and the ships that we used. And you can see when they left, where they were going, and how many Acadians wanted. And you'll notice there are 3 of them that had a little green star. The Boscawen and Union going to Pennsylvania, and the 2 sisters going to Connecticut. Those 3 ships sunk, and every Acadian was drowned. 190, 400, and 250, almost 800 Acadians drowned. Now, many others died on board the ships. So about a third of them total died before they got to port. Notice the welcoming party. They got to Boston. They debarking from the ship. Look at all the people, the bands and everything. Right? No, nobody knew they were coming. So they were just fortunate that eventually, after they had been in the harbor for about 3 weeks, they were allowed to get off the boats. And then they were spread out all over the place. Now, some of y'all may know a family up here by the name of Labine or Labine or something. Their ancestor, there you go, their ancestor was on those boats in Boston. And he was sent to a town called Wilmington, Massachusetts eventually. And he was able to get somebody to write some letters. In one of his letters, he's asking the council to provide better quarters for him and his family of 10 children. He says, when it rains, the hole in the roof leaks so bad that we got to huddle all together in one corner of the room just to get out of the water in our house that they gave us. And the council members said, why don't you build a boat? That was their answer to that. You know, so they weren't treated great. So the Arcadians that were forgotten, these were the ones in the southern part, they were rounded up and sent either to New York or Boston. And Boston ended up getting several waves of them, rightly so, I think, since they planned the whole thing. But they kept sending the extras to Boston. So we had a few hundred that ended up over there. These people in that area were seafarers. They were fishermen. They weren't farmers. They were a little better prepared for this boat trip than the others. With the island campaign, where I told you I wasn't too good at this. At the island campaign, where they captured them on Ile Royale and Ile St. John, they had to send them to France. When they captured Louisburg, they immediately went over to Prince Edward Island or Ile St. John. They had about 5,000 Acadians. About half of them realized they were coming and took off in little boats, went to New Brunswick and hid out. They were captured later and sent, deported. But the initial one, 2,500, were brought to Cape Breton Island and put in boats and sent to France along with the people on Prince Edward Island. And these are the operation of sending them there. It wasn't quite as bad, but notice we got 3 green stars again. We have the ruby, the Duke William, and the violet. And interestingly, everybody on the ruby, about half of them were lost, 190 out of 310. Everybody on the violet. The violet and the Duke William were traveling together. One started taking on water. The other went to help. A storm hit, and they both sunk. 5 people were saved, 5 Acadians. They were traitors in a sense. 4 of them took the lifeboat, abandoned their family, and jumped in the lifeboat. And the priest got in the lifeboat with them. Now the priest claims that the Acadians told him to save his life, and that's why he did it. And the only reason we know it happened is because the priest wrote about it afterwards, because they survived and got to England. And I sometimes wonder if the priest really was asked to go or whether he just went. But we know that the 4 Acadians weren't asked to go. They abandoned their wives and children and jumped in the lifeboat and were saved. The rest of them died. But if you look at some of the numbers there, you'll see a lot of others lost people. 148 out of 346, 58 out of 108. Almost half of them died in that voyage. Almost 1,000 people died going to France. So we have, unlike the ones that went to the U.S. colonies or the English colonies, we only have one manifest telling who arrived. We have all the manifest here. And you read it, and a woman gets off, and it says that her husband and 8 children died on the voyage of disease, and they had to throw them overboard. And then you read about another family that just survived and goes to the hospital, and 3 of them die right after arriving. So it was pretty sad for those people. It's amazing the Acadians survived, but they survived because we have a lot of children, and our children survived. For some reason we have genetics such that the children survive. Places where they landed was mainly St. Malo, right here. Some of them went into Brest, and some went into La Rochelle, which is somewhere right in this area here. So that was the places that they brought the Acadians primarily. And finally, we had some stragglers. We had some people up in New Brunswick that were captured. There was if y'all know anything, we developed something called guerrilla warfare. We used a lot in Vietnam. It's kind of a hit and run tactic. You know, you don't have a big enough force to beat your enemy, so you kind of hide in the woods, and when your enemy comes out, you go out there and you hit them real fast, kill 10 or 12 of them, run back and hide. And they had a fellow by the name of Joseph Broussard de Beausoleil. And he was leading a group of about 200 Acadians doing that. Scared the English to death, because besides the fact that they killed 10 or 12, they cut their heads off and put them on posts. So to warn the other British that, be careful. So it scared the British. And eventually, though, they got hit by a really bad winter after 2 years. They started losing their wives and children to the cold, and so he gave up and brought his crew in and gave up. And so they had several groups like that that were brought into these forts at Fort Cumberland right here, or Fort Edward, or St. George's Island that had a fort, or Annapolis Royal that had a fort. And eventually around 1762-63, they started deporting those people. I thought it was interesting. They had 600 of them right here at George's Island. They sent them to Boston, and now Boston was fed up with the Acadians. They said, we don't want them, and they sent them back. So they had to wait till 1763 before they could leave. Now in 1763, the Acadians were free to leave. These are just the forts, Cumberland, Fort Edward, and St. George's, or George's Island, rather, right here in the Halifax Harbor. In 1763, Acadians everywhere were free to go where they want. They weren't prisoners anymore. But if you don't have anything, you can't go anywhere. You know, you're stuck. And that's what happened. They were stuck in South Carolina. They were stuck in New York. They were stuck in Massachusetts. So they started petitioning the government to send them anyway somewhere, and the government to pay. And it took a few years. They were able to acquire a little bit of money because there wasn't any jobs for them. The farmers and all were aggravated because they didn't have enough jobs for themselves. So they didn't want the Acadians taking them. So they were able to eventually acquire a little money and acquire some help from the government, and were able to go places. And in the English colonies, where they went was, if you went below Massachusetts, you went to Louisiana. They thought Louisiana was French. They wanted to go to a French area. And they thought Louisiana was French, but they forgot. The King of France gave Louisiana to Spain in 1762, but didn't tell anyone. He forgot to tell them that. It's kind of mean. But anyway, they got to Louisiana, and they still spoke French, and the French government was still kind of in charge of it because the Spanish governor hadn't arrived for a couple of years. So they got to Louisiana. Those, if you were in Massachusetts and Connecticut and above it, you went to Quebec. And you didn't do too bad in Quebec, except, darn, it's cold up there, you know. But they got to Quebec, and so they settled there. Now, they had another option, in that if they really wanted to leave in 1763, the French government was building a naval base at Môle Saint-Domingue, which is today Haiti. And they offered to bring them free. And they promised them land, they promised them housing, food, and water. So a lot of Acadians around Philadelphia and all took them up on that and went. And that was a huge mistake. First, it's hot. Acadians were from a cold climate. And in a cold climate, you don't get a lot of disease. But you get in a tropical climate, you'll pick it up fast. Plus, the French lied to them. They gave them a swamp with non-potable water, or potable water. And so they started getting a lot of disease down there, and about half of them died. The only thing that saved them in Haiti was Louverture had a revolution about 20 years later, and the Acadians left and either went to Charleston, Baltimore, or New Orleans, and so some survived because of that. So that was the third option. Those that went to France, they stayed 30 years. The French government tried to find things for them to do. They thought the Acadians were excellent farmers. They paid them twice the dowry or the money that they paid their own peasants. They gave them 6 sol a day, which is like 6 cents a day per adult and 3 cents per child. They only gave their own people 3 sol a day. They tried to find a lot of things in farming and stuff for the Acadians, but the Acadians never made it. They didn't give them good land. They sent them to French Guiana. French Guiana is a very tropical place with a lot of disease. Most of the Acadians died there. They sent them to the Falkland Islands, which was great. They had about 80 to 100 that went there. Nice cold climate. They were doing very well for a year, and then a British ship showed up and said, "We own the Falkland Islands, guys." Decided it wasn't good to be in British territory, so they left. You know, but they tried a lot of different experiments, but it never worked. So finally, Spain needed some people, and they decided they would take them to Louisiana. In 1596, people opted to go to Louisiana. So that was the second major influx into Louisiana. So here's all the places that the Acadians went. During the deportations, you can see the ones that went on the Atlantic seaboard ended up in those states. Later on, they ended up in Maine and Louisiana. The Maine people were kind of interesting. They had two deportations. They escaped Nova Scotia in 1755 and went into an area just on the St. John River of New Brunswick. Stayed there for a few years, and then they had something in Louisiana, in the United States called the American Revolution. And for the Acadians, it was unfortunate in a way that the Americans won and not the British. Because since the Americans won, they had a lot of British Tories in North America and the United States, and they feared for their life. So they went to Canada. And where'd they go? New Brunswick. And they asked for land, and they not only asked for land, they asked for the land the Acadians will own, and the British government said, yeah, you were fighting for us and for us, so we'll give you that land. So the Acadians had to go farther north, and they ended up in the Madawaska area of northeastern Maine, the far northeastern Maine, and New Brunswick, that area of New Brunswick. And they stayed there as all Canada at that time, it wasn't Maine. And all of a sudden there was a fight between the U.S. and the Canadian government, and decided they would split Maine, and they would split that down the St. John River. In the middle of St. John River, if you own one side of it, you're in Canada. If you own the other side, you're in Maine. So brothers and sisters ended up in different countries. But they all get along well until we had 2001. And now we got to have passports to cross and everything, you know. Back then, it was just walk across the border. Canada, they had Acadians all in this part of Canada. St. Pierre and Miquelon, which is the only French territory left in North America today, and they still have French people there. Of course, if some of them I mentioned were sent to England, those guys eventually ended up in France and ended up coming to the United States. They were the first Acadians to ever own property in France, the first peasants. They were sent to Belle-Île-en-Mer, which is an island off of France, and they were given property. And they treasured that property. We have letters in Louisiana that they were sent back and forth, and they were telling their people, you can sell my property in Belle-Île-en-Mer. You know, they still, 100 years later, treasured their property and were allowing it to be sold. And they had, they were telling their cousins that was still there. Of course, in France, they went to these areas. There's still some Acadians in France that decided Louisiana wasn't good enough, I guess. They stayed. Saint-Domingue. And then these islands were some of the islands that France tried to send Acadians. And there's still a small Acadian community in Martinique. So we're still conniving, by the way. If you ever come to Louisiana, be ready to be joshed around a little bit. This was something out of Orange, Texas. So I have a few Acadian cousins here, a couple of them from hailing from Port Arthur, which is right by Orange. So they probably recognize this. You know, we're all poor, right? We know enough to park in the free spot. Okay? We ain't going to pay no dollar no matter how much money you have. You can't find a rich Cajun anyway, but a lot of them have oil. So if you're interested in Acadians, these are some fairly good books on Acadia. Some of the better ones that they have. This one is an excellent book on Acadia to give you an overview. And if you have time, myself and a couple of other folks from Maryland put together a website called AcadiansWereHere.org. It's designed for Acadians that are going to Maryland and want to see the remnants of the Acadians there between 1755 and 1763. So you can go and look on that website. We were given an award in February, I guess. They gave us their Historic Preservation Award for our website at the Senate Office Building in Annapolis, Maryland. So it's a pretty good website, I think. I didn't do a whole lot. I was just told them what to put on it, and a lady did it. So I appreciate y'all coming and listening to me. To finish by 8, or the golden slipper will fall from Cinderella. So I don't know what time it is. We got about 5 minutes. So if anybody has a question, I'll be happy to answer it. The question was, did the Acadians speak different dialects? Acadians, well, first they can understand anybody's French, whether you're Vietnamese, whether you're France or what. My mother speaks with Vietnamese and Parisians and everything. But yes, they do have different dialects. Even within Louisiana, there's about 15 dialects. Depends on where you settle. You came in, the Acadian French is the Acadian French of the 1600s. So whatever they had in France in the 1600s, that's the language they had. Yeah, hold it, I'll get it. Should go off. Oh, I know what's wrong.
Slow down.
Would you like another glass of wine?
Oh, shut up, there. That's my cousin. Y'all might know him, Bobby Charles. I don't know if anybody's heard it, ever heard See You Later Alligator and all? He wrote all these songs. But anyway, yes, they speak different dialects. In how the Acadians different from French people in France today? They're no different. Have the same genes basically if they came out of France, but they got isolated. They have their own culture. They actually have been declared in the court of law their own nation. They're the only European population to come to North America that formed their own nation because they developed their own culture, their own language. They have the things that make a nation they have. So they speak different language than the French in France, even though they can understand each other if you speak slow. For example, when the Acadians came to Louisiana, they encountered an animal called an alligator. There are no alligators in France. In France, they use the term cocodrie. Well, that's the term the Acadians picked up. But if you live in a marsh, you don't see you see alligators, but you also have some other animals that are different. And there was no word, so they made up words. So the language has a lot of words different than the French language does. The culture is different. Our food's different. Our food is a mix of African food, Spanish food, and Acadian fruit from Nova Scotia. So we have a lot of differences between us and them. People often ask, what's the difference in a Cajun and an Acadian? And the difference is, all true Cajuns are Acadian. But in Louisiana, we have a different culture and a different music even than the people in Nova Scotia. Okay? So Cajuns are just a little bit different culture than the people in Nova Scotia or the people in New Brunswick or in Argyle, Maine. Every one of us developed a little bit different culture, and we just call ourselves Cajuns. I don't know why.
So what's being done in Louisiana to maintain Cajun French?
Well, the best thing that's been done is what you heard tonight, music. Okay? It's amazing how many young people play Cajun music, and to do so, you got to speak the language. We also have programs called immersion programs, where we teach French as it's an optional program students can go into from kindergarten through high school, and every course except English is taught in French. So they pick up the French language that way. And a lot of the older people speak French, and they enjoy having the young people come and talk to them and all. But you can go in, it's not spoke widely in South Louisiana anymore, but you can still hear a lot of French spoken in the Cajun areas of Louisiana. Mm-hmm.
How did you keep the language alive when it was outlawed by the U.S. government in 1917 for 60 years?
Now you're meeting me, who doesn't speak French, okay? Yes, in the early 1900s, the English government of Louisiana decided that these kids better speak English and not French if they could get ahead in the world. So they banned French in all of the schools, and you were punished. If you couldn't say, I want to go to the bathroom in French, you didn't go to the bathroom. You wet your pants. If you spoke it on the school ground, you got hit with a ruler. So consequently, being Acadian was a negative thing, and parents didn't want their kids to grow up being Acadian. And so they didn't teach their kids to speak French. Now, they spoke French at home among themselves, and some kids just picked it up, so there was a remnant that was kept alive until the 1960s. Actually, in 1950s, when our Arcadians went to France to fight in World War II, 40s I should say, and when they came back, they realized they had something unique. And they began to listen to Cajun music again, and they began to speak Cajun French again, and then Codafil came in, and that's our Council for Development of French in Louisiana, came in 1960 and started these immersion programs. So it's what brought it back together. Interesting quick story about France. When our soldiers went to Poitiers, the Americans that were in their units with them considered them about the scum of the earth because they didn't speak much English, and what little they did, they had a heavy accent. And they considered them the scum of the earth. Until they noticed that every evening they come back with some wine and cheese. And so the Arcadians were eating pretty good. And so they started getting a little elevated, and they'd bring back some for the other people, you know. Then the commanders noticed that, and they started bringing them on the command staff as translators. And then they had a guy by the name of Wild Bill Donovan, who started what's called, he was tasked with doing the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. That later became our CIA. And he was tasked with getting people that could go behind the enemy lines and help the French resistance. And he knew that if he taught people to speak French, they could speak French fluently. But the Germans could tell that they weren't French. They didn't have the right accent, and they didn't look right. But the Arcadians spoke the same exact French as in Poitiers. You couldn't tell the difference, and they looked just like them. So he brought these Acadians in, and he told them, look, we have a mission. You may not survive. In fact, there's a good chance you won't. But we want you to volunteer. And they did. And they went behind the lines. And they were known as Jedburgh. And they eventually got the French resistance organized, and they were able to help the American cause that way. Several of them are still alive today. They're in their 90s. I have a friend, Bob LeBlanc, that's one of them, and that did that. And they didn't all survive, but most of them survived it. But at that point, they became elevated a little bit and realized they really had something. So. There were always some old-time Cajun musicians that played. They played at home, you know, when they, until the...
should not be speaking French, right?
Yeah, they spoke French. Yeah,
But they shouldn't have,
Ma'am?
they should not have been speaking illegal.
They shouldn't have been. You could do it at home. You just said. Are you saying they couldn't do it in school? Yeah, but you could do what you wanted at home. And they played at home. They had porch dances, and they basically they call them porch dances. They would take all the furniture out of the house, and everybody would come and dance in the living rooms and all. And of course, you had a few fights too, you know, when the liquor flowed. But they kept the music alive that way. And then when the soldiers came back, they started going back to the dance halls at that point. And we had dance halls everywhere. There's just a few that survived today. But they had them, every little community had 2 or 3 dance halls. And so it survived that way. Okay, so it's time to quit. Last answer, somebody wanted to know why I'm wearing sabots, which are the wooden shoes. That's what they wore in Nova Scotia, sabots. They have a lot of advantages. They're wide, so when you're walking in the wet marshes, you don't sink as much. If you get wet, leather shoes take a day or two to dry out. Wooden shoes dry out in a couple of hours. So they have that advantage. And, you know, people think those are Dutch shoes. Well, the Dutch and French weren't that far apart, so they were wearing them in the marsh areas of France, too. So, thank y'all.